Go for it.
Welcome to Law and Justice. I'm Jane Mulcahy. This is a special series on the topic of how to talk policy and influence people. And today I'm speaking to Lorna Bogue from the Green Party about primarily environmental policy, because obviously this is crucial at a time of climate crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic. Lorna, thanks so much for joining me.
Yeah, no worries at all. Thank you so much for having me on.
Can you tell me a little bit about yourself, Lorna, and how you got involved in the Green Party and interested, I suppose, wider in environmental issues?
Yeah, well, I joined the Green Party through a process of elimination. I was a bit annoyed in general. I came out of my first degree in the middle of the last recession. So I was just a bit tired of the way things were. I was quite angry all the time, frustrated. So I decided that I needed to actually go and do something about it. So I decided with one of my friends to join a political party. And then we went through a process of elimination. And at the end of the list, after I'd eliminated everyone else, was the Green Party. Which I wasn't particularly happy about at the time.
Right.
But I started going to meetings and stuff like that. I suppose the environmental issue is something that obviously I'd learned about at school, and I thought it was generally important, but I think my environmentalism has kind of grown over the years, because my initial kind of my initial reason for joining the party was more welfare issues. It was more based around social justice and those kind of things. So I suppose over time I've sort of started to see things through a more green lens as well. But that's been a process that has been changing all the time. Like I think activism has changed a lot over the years. So
that's very interesting. I think you're probably not alone there, in the sense of people kind of it dawning on us, whether you're in a political party or not, that we can no longer kind of keep our eyes closed to the enormity of the task facing us. Do you think, for example, young people like Greta Thunberg have kind of lit a fire under the hindquarters of politicians the world over, or done more than many of them have collectively to raise awareness really of the climate issue?
I think she's done more than what politicians have done collectively. I think I was actually watching her speech yesterday. I've had cause to be watching it a lot lately. Do you know the one where she goes to the UN and she makes a speech like, "How dare you? Like, you've destroyed my childhood. I shouldn't be here. You're not doing anything about it." I've always found that a rather difficult video to watch, because she starts off and she says something along the lines of, "We're watching you," and then people laugh about it. There's kind of like a little chuckle like goes through the room, because oh, she's so feisty and cute. Like, isn't that cute what she's saying? And they don't really see her so much as a threat. And then as the speech goes on, it becomes more and more apparent, and you can feel the atmosphere of the room get more somber as she does it. But the thing that I would take from it really is that she has done more, and what she has really done is that she's actually exposed a lot of the political discourse around environmentalism as just not being radical enough. And I think there's a lot of issues of political environmentalism where we just can't conceptualize the type of radical change that's required, and people see environmentalism in a political context as, oh well, we'll say sustainability a lot, like, isn't that enough for you, like, or we'll plant trees, like, you like that, right? Like, and there's no actual conception of how the struggle for climate and the environmental struggle is actually completely intertwined with social justice. Like those two things cannot be separated at all. And I think what she exposed is a lot of the greenwashing that goes on in the political sphere. But it's a difficult watch, because I mean, like, the political sphere is the world that I inhabit. And you know, people say to Greta Thunberg all the time stuff like, you know, why don't you like go to school and study this stuff? Why don't you go and run for election? Why don't you engage in the political process? You know, why don't you smile more? Why don't you do this and that? And as someone who has done that, who goes to the doors, who smiles,
Yes.
who went to college, who did all of this kind of stuff, like it's not going to help you, like,
Right, yeah.
the day. So yeah, I think she's done a lot, and I think she needs to keep at it, because I think the climate and social justice struggles, neither of them are going to be resolved by government alone. It has to be like a complete grassroots movement as well. Oh, sorry. But yeah, it has to be a complete grassroots movement as well, and all of society has to change. And the way that we do things, our entire economy has to change as well. Because like I went back to college and did a master's in economics. And you know, again, like just every incentive that we have is just wrong. It's always entirely predicated on profit. It's entirely predicated on individualism and getting ahead of each other and competitiveness. It's very hierarchical. It's very patriarchal and male. It's intertwined with colonialism as well. Like, our entire economic system is wrong. It's not fit for purpose. And for me, the question is like, how do we actually move beyond that? And I don't think that the political sphere alone has the capacity to actually have that kind of discussion. Because, you know, again, like when you're running for election, I mean, like, the inherent promise of any politician on the door is that if you, my constituent, walk down to your polling station on a certain day, get a piece of paper and mark it in a certain way, and then we'll count the pieces of paper, and then society will completely change as a result of you doing that. I mean, like, fundamentally, the fundamental promise of all electoral politics is a complete kayfabe. Like, it's just
a bit of a fabrication.
Yeah, and it's so shallow. It's inherently shallow as a process, and we're never actually going to get to a situation where we can actually reach our climate targets or avert climate crisis from happening if we can't actually have that societal discussion as a whole. So I think Greta Thunberg is taking the right approach, and I think what she has to say is very important. But she's running into a problem, which is that people love to see young women speaking, but they don't like to hear what we're saying, and especially if it threatens them. So that's why she gets, you know.
It's very true. I mean, the amount of livid middle-aged men who respond to her, I mean, she drives them crazy for some reason, and they're then deaf to the very important message. It's like, how dare she, this little young upstart, be dominating the airwaves with this? Or I don't quite know what it is really, but the virulent responses. And yet she's brought all manner of young people with her, you know, teenagers who might never have gotten interested in protesting anything. And maybe some of it's cynical, the getting off school before the shutdown to go and do a strike, I don't know. But I have heard of lots of teenagers who really believe their futures are being squandered. There's a lot of uncertainty in the world, and right now with the pandemic. Do you think that the pandemic has taught us anything, Lorna, about what we can do to at least slow down some of the climate change? Because the environment has benefited from us not, you know, jetting around the place. The streets are empty, so there's less toxic emissions. We're not going to do this voluntarily, but what can we do as individuals and as states?
Yeah, so I've been thinking a lot about this because obviously I follow a lot of environmental groups. So like I've self-selected to be in the sphere
where a lot of this environmental discourse is happening. I think the main thing that we can take from this pandemic is that people in general have real preferences about the welfare of other people. People in pandemic situations, or indeed in most other crisis situations, tend to behave in a way that is pragmatic, and they tend to behave in a way that is cooperative. And the only way to get out of a situation like a pandemic or any other type of crisis is through cooperation. It's not through competition, it's through cooperation. So fundamentally, I think that the community efforts that people are making are very good. And I think that that's exactly the kind of thing that we should be learning from this crisis and from this pandemic. I take a bit of issue with some of the triumphalism that I have seen around the way that society grinding to a halt like this has had positive external effects on the environment. So all of this stuff about, you know, dolphins, you know, jumping through crystal clear water in Venice, which is also just like not
didn't happen. Yeah,
whatever. You know, oh, the skies are so clear now, the air is so good. All of this stuff, like, there's kind of a triumphalism around that, which betrays, in some instances, a type of environmentalism that doesn't have people in it, and specifically doesn't have poor people in it. You know, so like that's I take a bit of issue with that particular kind of train of thought. Like I think what we have learned from this crisis is that, like, the types of people that we have valued in our society up until this point, so all of the tech bros, all of the financial institutions, all of the various different you know, types of financial capitalism, all of those, you know, HR managers and bosses and managerial classes of people, in a crisis, they're not necessary that much. They're not necessary. There's so many people who are doing jobs, because like I worked for years in call centers myself. Like half of my workday was spent trying to look busy, as opposed to like, and being micromanaged to the nth degree to ensure that I continued to look busy and actually, you know, moderated my behavior with it. Like so many people are living in these panopticons that have been created through capitalism, that now this virus has actually exposed all of that as, well, do you know what? You may be making a lot of money, but are you actually useful to society? Most of the time, the answer to that question is no, you're not. Your work is not contributing to society. And the people who are extremely valuable to society are the people who are collecting rubbish, the people who are working in retail, the people who are working in the healthcare system, people who have caring roles, and that for me is what this whole thing has exposed. And then on top of that, like as a counsellor, what I'm seeing is that parts of society that we have, you know, shunted away, and, you know, all of these problems that we pretend to keep a lid on a lot of the time, like as soon as a crisis hits, they become extremely acute issues. And it has exposed things like direct provision, like the way travellers are treated, like the way people in social housing are treated, like the way that people are institutionalised, people in prisons. All of these people have been put into extremely dangerous situations by the state. The state has put them in that situation in the first place, and now the state is scrambling to
get them
try
out.
and resolve the issues that the state created in the first place. So I think that it's this whole thing has been like, it's been a human tragedy. Ultimately, it's a human tragedy, and it's people who get hurt in the end. It's people who are vulnerable who are the ones who will suffer the most from this. But I think what it's also shown is like an entire structural break. in terms of how our society is formed, and what are we going to come out of afterwards in terms of what we actually place value on as a society, because I think fundamentally that has to change. And then if you take an issue like climate crisis, the only way that we will be able to deal with that or to avert that crisis from happening is actually through cooperating, is actually through forming our own communities, is actually through self-sufficiency and resilience and cooperation, and people being able to make decisions at the lowest effective level where they know the local conditions and they can actually make their own decisions for themselves. Like that's ultimately, I think, the type of world that we should be looking at once this particular crisis is over. Because I think there's a big move now, you know, and again, like this is coming from like parties of the status quo, agents of the status quo, the state itself. Well, once this is done, we'll get back to normal. But normal for a lot of people, normal for a lot of people was shit in the first place. So why in God's are we going to try and replicate that or reproduce that again? Like that to me doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Like normal, going back to normal would be us careening off a cliff edge in terms of climate crisis and ending up with a planet that is uninhabitable for human life at the end of the day. So, you know, we're gonna have to try and
do better.
Do better. Like that's it.
Yeah. And so you mentioned there that the parties of the status quo, well, two of them, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, are trying to form a government now rather than just the caretaker status quo that we've had dealing with the pandemic. And the Greens have been always mentioned as a possible key partner in this. If the Greens do go into government, Lorna, I presume from what you've just said there, then you're hoping that they can leverage what power they have then to push the other two parties into real change, equitable change, sustainable future, a real future for all people, including migrants, including travellers, including those on the margins. Would that be fair to say that would be what you'd hope to see?
I would hope to see that, yes, but at the same time, there's lots of things that I hope for that are not possible. Right. So, you know, like I would hope to be at least a few inches taller, but that ain't happening. So I think we have to be realistic and pragmatic about it. I mean, my views are very much well known because, like, I've stood up at our conventions and have said these things. I have always been quoted in articles in newspapers whenever anyone could ever possibly be bored enough to try and look into what the Green Party is up to. As having a particular point of view, and my point of view is that, again, like if we want to have the radical change that's required, we have to completely break with the way that things have been done before, and like even the way that we engage with the electoral system, or thinking that the electoral system that we have in Ireland is good enough when it really disenfranchises a lot of people. It's a very shallow process, as I've explained. I personally be of the opinion that it's possible to change Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. Now, I think it's totally okay for the party to go and talk to them and see what possible concessions they could win.
Yeah.
But from reading about, you know, all of this stuff, because like I'm a party member, I'm a councillor, but like I'm not in the parliamentary party, so I wouldn't have too much of an insight into what's going on there. But I mean, from what I'm reading, and like even reading this document today now, like it's just not good enough. Like what they're saying is just not good enough. And for me, like environmentalism isn't just like a flavor that you put on your policies. It's not something you sprinkle on top like as a nice little thing,
or a few footnotes.
Yeah. So I just don't really see how Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael could offer anything that would bring about the change that would be needed. And even for people who are, you know, much further to the center than I am, because like I'm very, like I've always been very left wing. I'm actually, I think over time with the evolution of my activism, I think I'm actually going further towards anarchism more than anything else now.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, do you know that thing of like, you know, people tend to become more right wing as they get older?
Yeah.
Like I think I'm going completely the opposite way, and the more I see of politics, the more I'm actually kind of like, do you know what, this is not working. This is not working for anyone. You know, it only works for certain people. Usually, like in Ireland, our electoral system really is predicated on home ownership. In my opinion, like I think the way that you can't change address, the way that you know, people are either registered or not. Like I think people like the, you know, like even for general election, like, you know, there's plenty of people who live and work here who actually can't vote in it. So, you know, it's just kind of like, it's just a system that disenfranchises so many, and really just it prioritizes people who own homes. And that's the politics that we have in this country, which is about, you know, do we increase the value of property? You know, which party would increase the value of my property? That's kind of the way it seems to go. Yeah, I just.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I know you have to go because you have another meeting, but just on one last question that kind of ties into that about housing and homelessness. One thing that we've seen with this pandemic was a very swift response to do things that they had previously said could not be done, like freezing evictions, capping rents. You know, a lot of the Airbnb accommodation in Dublin was all of a sudden available for people to actually rent or live in, or to house homeless people. The Constitution and the right to property was no longer an impediment when the common good meant that for public health and safety, we needed people off the streets. Is there anything that we can learn from that about the business of policy making going forward?
Yeah, that it was always possible, in the first place, and they just said that it wasn't possible, and we shouldn't allow people like that to continue to stay in positions of power. It's as simple as that. Like this is a human tragedy. The virus is a human tragedy. You know, we're all in our homes right now. We're all extremely concerned about people at home. I haven't seen my parents for a long time because they both have underlying conditions. I've been here, and you know, and as a counsellor, like I'm seeing just what is being exposed is just the lives of quiet desperation that people have, like, and people have always had, and all of this stuff now that, you know, suddenly we're having pretty much like socialism is happening now in Ireland, that we're doing away with property rights, and on top of that we're making a massive public one-tier healthcare system, and that we're removing like privatization from basically all arms of the state in the state of emergency. Like, this is capitalism using socialist policies in order to preserve itself. And you know, what we have to do now is we have to make sure that this isn't a temporary measure, because it always could have been done. It always could have been done, and it's not acceptable, you know, just to say, well, things are suddenly different now. Like, this should have always been the case. It should have always been the case, that people would have access to housing, that people would have access to health, that people would have access to food. Like, we have to bring down our entire economic system to looking at how do we actually provide all of the things that people need to thrive. How do we actually create an economic system that does that first and foremost, and then after that you can look at things like growth, if that's something you're interested in, or, you know, look at all these various different industries and stuff like that. Like, we should always have had access to this stuff, and then the government turning around and granting it as if it's granting wishes right now, when actually it's giving people the basic things that they've needed and have always needed all along. So this can't end up being a temporary measure, and Fianna Fáil Fine Gael should not be using this situation to consolidate power, because what they will do then is they will take all of this stuff back, and what we're going to get now for the next few years is an absolute, you know, screaming train of, well, now you have to pay for it, and
right.
Who's going to
austerity, more austerity.
We're going to get austerity. We're going to get austerity now, and who's going to pay for this stuff? And ultimately, at the end of the day, the only thing that Fianna Fáil Fine Gael can conceptualise is that poor people will pay for it, and we'll find ways to ensure that our voters, our clientele, don't actually have to pay for this. So, you know, like it's the same thing with, like, you know, looking at all these tech pros. I mean, like, there's one particularly prominent one, and he's making a big deal on Twitter about PPE, like the protective equipment. So, like, the Irish state was spending 15 million euro a year on all PPE up until this point. Now, during the course of this crisis, they've gone up to 220 million. But, like, if I was a tech bro and I wanted to make a point, PPE is a great thing to buy, because you can buy so many masks, and, you know, how are these masks produced? Well, they're produced in very bad conditions in other countries. I can exploit cheap labor in order to produce all of these masks. So I'll make a big hoo-ha about the doctors and nurses not having masks. And then what I'll do is I'll bring in a big consignment of masks from somewhere, you know, where the labor is cheap. And mightn't even cost that much. It might cost a few million. That same tech bro has a fund in the US. It's a venture capital fund, and it's worth $50 million. And he has it domiciled in a certain state in the US, because then he doesn't have to pay tax on it. So, like, these same people who are leeching, they are parasites upon the rest of society because they don't pay their taxes. They frequently drain the networks that we have in order to provide the services that people need. Like, ultimately, they are responsible. They are responsible for our health service falling apart and crumbling the way that it has been for decades. They're responsible for that. The state is responsible because it's not taxing these people, and they're just letting people away with it. And then they come up during a crisis out of the woodwork. Oh, look, I'm here, a white knight. I'm here to save you all now from this. And look at all of this stuff that I've bought for you. But in reality, in comparison to the amount of money that they have leached from the state in the first place, it's nothing. It's pittance. They're giving crumbs from the table, and yet people just don't see this. And then they're just, you know, oh, sure, isn't he a great fella now? Isn't it great that he's doing this? What a hero. And it's not. It doesn't work like that. Like, you know, like I had this thread on Twitter where I was talking about this, and basically, like, if you look at something like a ventilator, for example, a ventilator by itself, sitting in a room, is just a machine. You know, like, it may be a very complex and expensive piece of equipment, but at the end of the day, if you don't have people who have been trained up to use it, if you don't have people who are paid good wages and given good conditions in order to use it, if you don't have all of the medicines that are required to put someone on a ventilator, if you don't have, you know, an anaesthetist, if you don't have nurses, if you don't have cleaners in the hospital, like, it's just a piece of equipment and you're not going to be able to do anything with it. So those networks, and society is that network. If those networks have been denuded and degraded over time, you don't get to turn up and say, well, look at this shiny new ventilator I bought you, because you personally are responsible for making that machine essentially useful in the first place. So, you know, like, and that goes for billionaires, that goes for tech pros, and that goes for the state as well.
The one percenters, basically, yeah. One final question, Lorna, just to return to the environment. you know, you mentioned before other countries, poorer countries, who have traditionally for a very long time borne the brunt of climate change or extreme weather conditions. That's some of the reason that there's been an increase in migration from some parts of the world. Do you think, as part of our looking at dealing with the climate crisis, but also having more of a humane, human rights-based approach in general, that we need to do more in this country for asylum seekers and refugees?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think the mass migration kind of trope comes up a lot. I suppose at the end of the day, like at any one time, only 1% of the population of the world tends to actually move from their own places. But yeah, I think the way to look at that again, you know, if you look at the conception of capitalism as we know it right now, like it's inherently embedded in colonialism, and like that's the burden that we have to accept, and that's the responsibility that we have to accept in countries like Ireland, because you know because we're a country that has been colonized as well. Sometimes we tend to think of ourselves as, you know, well, you know, we're, you know, same struggle, same fight, like, you know, we're not like that, we're different. And there's a certain exceptionalism to that as well, because you know, like there were Irish slave owners, there were Irish people who benefited from that. I mean, like we while we were colonized, we were also economically riding on the wave of colonialism. So while we personally weren't colonizing people, we were also, you know, benefiting from the various trading kind of arrangements that came up as a result of the colonialism of the British Empire. So it's something that we need to be particularly careful of here, because I think even though we can say that we were colonized, we also have a certain amount of privilege with that maybe other countries that were colonized don't have. And then on top of that, then you have, you know, the intersection of racism as well, because obviously, you know, Irish people, you know, like that's kind of, you know, like that's kind of an intersecting thing as well. Although I think over time we kind of need to, you know, pull whiteness and Irishness away from each other, because
Sure.
like that's a harmful kind of conception as well. And yeah, I think as part of that, yeah, we definitely should be treating people like, I mean, like I just think in general, like that, like borders are just an extremely violent concept anyway. And I've just over time, like I'm just like, we just shouldn't even bother with it, like, because, you know, you're not going to get this influx of people, but also we should have a state that can support people, and, you know, bring people along with us. Like I think, and I think especially with something like climate crisis as well, like the existence of borders makes that even more difficult to deal with as well, because climate crisis doesn't respect any border. Like borders are human constructs, so like why in God's name are we, you know, like just being so violent towards people because of this concept of a border? Like, you know, that's the problem. Well, like we shouldn't be engaging with things like deportations. We shouldn't be engaging with, you know, like making people feel unwelcome or hiving them off in centers, or institutionalizing people. Like, you know, I've just gotten very, you know, like as I say, like I'm moving further and further towards anarchism, but like I think fundamentally that people are, I think people fundamentally are good, and I think that people need to be supported, and I think a lot of the issues that people have, like, are just because of violence and trauma that's inflicted on them, and that's what the state, I suppose, insofar as the state exists, should be trying to deal with. Like it's looking after people and
yes,
you know, giving people the ability to look after themselves. And it's about empowerment. It's not about, you know, like, you know, handing people or, you know, patronizing people,
yes,
or, you know, traumatizing them
down, yeah. No, I agree with so much of that, Lorna. Lorna, I better let you go because I've kept you long enough. But listen, thank you so much for talking to me. Thank you for the remarkable work that you're doing. You're a fascinating person, and you know, it's great that you're in Cork City Council now. Please God, or whatever, Buddha, Alathorn, Odin, whatever, the universe, you might get an opportunity to be in the Dáil, you know, before too long. You did very well in the recent election, didn't you, in Cork?
Yeah, well, I mightn't have a chance the way I've started talking lately. Like,
well, you never know. You never know. I'm sure there are people who think like you. You know, they may not be necessarily in the party, but you know what, we do need more radical thinking and more radical solutions, because the softly tepid, a tiny bit here, a tiny bit there, isn't doing enough on any of the issues that we've touched on briefly, let alone on dealing with the destruction of the planet. So I'll let you get off to your next meeting. Thanks for talking policy.
Thank you for listening to my rant.
Thanks a million. This was Law and Justice, How to Talk Policy and Influence People with Lorna Bogue. Thanks.